Shalom everyone and welcome to Busisiwe, blessed in English, Baruch in Hebrew, which means increase, fruitfulness and multiplication. My name is Abigail. We continue with the series titled The Reign of Yahuwah. And in this series we've gone through different teachings. The first one we had to look at what is the definition of the reign of Yahuwah. And we saw how Shaul defines it in the book of Romans chapter 14 verse 17, where he starts by saying, the reign of Yahuwah is not eating or drinking. So he defines what it is by what it is not. We then had a full teaching exploring what does it mean to say that the reign of Yahuwah is not eating and drinking. And then we went then to another teaching where we then, as Shaul is defining the reign of Yahuwah by what it is after having defined it as what it is not. And then he says that the reign of Yahuwah is obedience. We then went through a teaching on what is obedience, which is Shema in Hebrew. And with that understanding, we saw that Shema in Hebrew means to listen, to give your attention to someone or something, to understand, to submit, and to subject one to subject two. We then looked at who is understanding, and we then learned that we're not talking about what is understanding, but if anything, we're talking about who is understanding. And we established that Yahusha, Hamashiach, is understanding, and that we found the definition in many scriptures, including the book of Proverbs chapter 8. And then we also continued on looking at who are we to submit to, which we also established that we are to submit ourselves unto Yahusha, who is the groom, and we as the assembly, we are the bride. He is our husband and we are his wife as an assembly collectively. So we looked at Ephesians chapter 5, that was looking at the relationship between the husband and the wife, where Shaul explains, or otherwise known as Paul, that in fact this mystery is about Yahusha and his bride being the assembly. But nonetheless, the husbands need to treat their wives as such, and also the wives treat and respect and honor and submit to their husbands as such. Then the part that we continuing with the definition also of Romans 14 verse 17 is that we then also today we'll be looking at two aspects of this definition. So we have gone through two aspects of the definition of the reign of Yahuwah. The first one was defining it by what it is not, which is that it was not eating and drinking. The second one, which we've gone through on the teaching, was that the reign of Yahuwah is obedience, and we find out that obedience refers to Shema, or it is Shema in Hebrew. And then today we'll then be looking at the other definition of the reign of Yahuwah, which is that it is peace. For again, as a reminder, the book of Romans chapter 14 reads, for the reign of Yahuwah is not eating and drinking, but obedience, peace, and joy in the Ruach HaKodesh. So then today we'll then be looking at what is peace, which is shalom in Hebrew, and then we'll expand on that. And then we'll also look at what is joy, which is shemach in Hebrew, and then we will expand on that. Now, The first part that I want us to then look at, which is probably some of the people are asking question as we are going through this reign of Yahuwah. Most of you could be probably asking yourself, why do I always teach from a Hebrew perspective? Why do I always make reference to what is this word in English, what is it in Hebrew, and what does it mean? And then let's now zoom in into why do we teach from the Hebrew perspective. And the answer as to why I actually teach from the the answer to the question of why I teach from the Hebrew perspective, other than the fact that the word of Yahuwah was written in the scrolls in Hebrew, other than the fact that when Yahuwah spoke to the nation of Yasharel, he spoke to them in their language, and their language was Yasharel. But we actually find in the book of Yubal, otherwise known as Jubilee, chapter 12, verse 25 to 27, that Hebrew is the language of creation, which means that before the Tower of Babel, we all know that before the Tower of Babel, there was one language. But from the Tower of Babel, Yahuwah confused their language, and so that they do not understand one another's speech. And we find that where Yahuwah confused their language, we find that in the book of Barashith, chapter 11, verse 7, as they're building the Tower of Babel. Barashith chapter 11, verse 7, otherwise known as Genesis chapter 11, verse 7, where it says that Yahuwah confused their language. And we can see from there that it says Yahuwah confused their language, meaning singular, as in they were speaking one, the whole earth was speaking one language. Now, you could then be asking yourself, where am I coming? Where do we get the understanding of what language was that one language that was spoken before the Tower of Babel, or before Yahuwah confused that the language? What language was that? And we find the answer to that in the book of Yobal, chapter 12, verse 25 to 27. Yobal or Jubilees chapter 25 verse 20 Yobal chapter 12 verse 25 to 27, or Jubilees chapter 12. Why am I tongue twisting? It's Yobal Jubilee chapter 12 verse 25 to 27. I do understand that these are some of the books that were removed from the Bible that we have access to. But you can actually Google Jubilees chapter 12 verse 25 to 27, and you can be able to read this, or just Google the book of Jubilee. It is available online, and I've also spoken before that there are some versions that still have these books that were removed on our original or on the Bibles that we're using. And then I'm reading from the version called Sefer, which still has, which replaced these books. And I said Sefer is Cepher, and it reads as follows. And Yahuwah Alua said, open his mouth and his ears, that he may hear and speak with his mouth, with the tongue which has been revealed. Now, let's talk about the context. It's always important. When Yahuwah Alua said, open his mouth and his ears, who is he speaking to? Who is he instructing to open whose mouth? Now, I'm going to take a little bit step away from this question from the context. We know that Moshe wrote the Torah, and most people refer to the Torah as the first five books of the Bible, being Genesis, Exodus, Deuteronomy, Leviticus, as well as Numbers. But we know that Moshe wrote more than those five books. Some of the books that Moshe wrote were removed from the Bibles that we're using. And one of the books that Moshe wrote is actually the book of Jubilees, which provides more context into the book of Genesis. Now, how did Moshe know all this information? Yahweh instructed an angel to relate the story of creation to Moshe, of everything that happened, because all these things happened, especially those written in the book of Genesis. Moshe was not there, but the angel is the one who was instructed by Yahuwah to narrate the story of creation. And you can find this also on the playlist under YouTube that is titled The Sixth Day of Creation, where then the same Malak, Malak is the Hebrew name for angel, so the same Malak narrated the story of creation to Moshe. Now, what we see in this case is that Moshe was not the first person to be writing the history of creation or to be writing the word of Yahweh. And I also mentioned in that series, Sixth Day of Creation, that the first person that wrote, who was actually called the scribe of Yahuwah, was Hanok, otherwise known as Enoch. So Enoch was the first person to transcribe or to deduce in writing everything that had happened. And also looking at the genealogy or the lineage, when Enoch or Hanok was writing, he was not there at the time when Adam was created, or Eve, and many other people that lived before him, including his forefathers and Yared and so many others and so forth. So he had to be told what happened, and he was told by an angel. So Yahweh started with Hanok, started with Enoch, to be sending an angel, to be sending a malak to human beings, to instruct them, to narrate, to teach them how to write and to deduce the word of Yahuwah in writing. So the first one was the first one was Enoch. Now, in this particular scripture that we are now referring to, which is Yubal chapter 12, verse 25 to 27, or Jubilees chapter 12, verse 25 to 27, the Malak was sent to Abram. So in this case, where it says that, and Yahuwah Aluah said to the angel, open his mouth and his ears. And the person that the angel was instructed to open his mouth and his ears was Abram. And when you read the full chapter 12, you'll be able to get context that this was a time where Abram had run away from his hometown, from his land of Kalzadim, or under the city of Ur, where Nimrod was the king at the time. And he had run away because he had destroyed the idols of his father. And Abram's father was actually one of the most honorable princes in the kingdom of Nimrod, reporting directly to Nimrod. And they were all at that time worshipping idols. So he knew that since his father has found out that he has destroyed all the idols, this word is going to get to the ears of Nimrod, and he was going to be killed as a result. And as such, he then ran away. And that's when then, at the point where he's at, then Yahuwah then sends an angel as Abram was making this prayer to say, what must happen now? Must he go back to his homeland where he ran away from? Or what is it? What are the plans that Yahuwah has concerning him? What must happen? And Yahuwah answered his prayer. And part of answering this prayer was also to send a malak, or to send an angel who was to do this particular task which Yahuwah tasked or instructed the angel to do. And then it reads, and Yahuwah Elohim said, open his mouth and his ears, referring now to Abram, that he may hear and speak with his mouth with the language which has been revealed. For it had ceased from the mouths of all the children of men from the day of the overthrow of Babel. And I opened his mouth and his ears and his lips, and I began to speak with him in Abarit, otherwise known as Hebrew, in the tongue of their creation. So this is when now we establish that the tongue of creation, this one tongue, this one language that was spoken before the Tower of Babel confusion, was Hebrew. And it continues then to say, and he took the Sepharim of his fathers, meaning Abram took the Sepharim. Sepharim is, Sephar in English is just books. So Sepharim is plural. So he then took the books of his fathers, and these were written in Abarit. So even the books that Abram were reading, they were also written in Abarith or in Hebrew. And these are the books that coming as far down as Shem and who passed them on and so forth up until it then gets to Abram, because they always treasured all these possessions of Yahweh as they were obedient to him. So he had these books, but because of the confusion of the language, he no longer knew the Hebrew language. So the books were there, but he could not even make sense of them because he did not know the language, following Yahuwah confusing that language in the Tower of Babel. Hence the angel had to be then sent to open his mouth, to open his ears and his lips, and to teach him this language. And when that happened, then Abram started to transcribe them, and he began from henceforth to study them. And then the angel made known to him that which he could not understand. So when Abram had questions and did not understand something as he was transcribing and studying this, then the angel was there to clarify or to bring clarity and understanding to Abram. And it took Abram 6 months to learn the language, as it says here, and he studied them during the 6 rainy months. So now we have established how did Abram learn the language of his forefathers, or the language of creation. And we find that what language was in the book of Yubal or Jubilees, chapter 12, verse 25 to 27. Now then the question is, why did this malak, or why did this angel teach Abram Hebrew when he could have learned Yahuwah's word in the language that was spoken at the time? I mean, there was the Canaanites were living at the time. He was even coming from Babel, which is known as Babylon. So there was a Babylonian language that was even spoken at the time. There was probably Phoenician language that was spoken at the time, possibly Aramean language also that was spoken at the time. But why specifically Yahuwah instructed the malak, or instructed the angel to teach Abram the word in Hebrew? Why did he teach him the Hebrew language? And this is a question that most people ask in our times these days. They say, what does it matter whether you learn from a Greek perspective, or from a Latin perspective, or from English perspective? At the end of the day, Yahuwah knows our heart. If that was the case, he would have then taught, he would have sent an angel to teach Abram the word in the Babylonian language, which Abram was familiar with. He was speaking as he was coming from Babylon, possibly an Aramean language, which he would have been familiar with, or Phoenician language, whichever language of the East that was used at the particular time. We're going to answer that question at the end. The other part that I want also to just start questioning things, because Yahweh gave us mind, gave us intellect, that we are not able to just monkey see, monkey do. He's given us a cognitive understanding to say, why is this happening? Why is this particular case? So we're not just taking what the pastors or what the preachers say. That's why even when you look at the book of Acts, we are told that the assembly from Berea, which is called the Berean, after they heard what Shaul said, they then went themselves and searched the scriptures for themselves, so that they can not just be believing what someone else said, but that they can know what is and understand from having read themselves, having understood themselves, and then they'll be able to accept that, having their own personal conviction. Now, with that in mind, I want to ask then the second question. Now, the second question is that we all know the conversion of Shaul, otherwise known as Paul, who was a Pharisee who was killing the believers of the time, who were the believers of the way of Yahusha. And on that particular day, where we are reading from the book of Acts, chapter 26, from verse 13 to verse 15, Acts chapter 26, from verse 13 to 15, this was the time where Shaul was riding his horse together with some people that he was with, and on his way to Damascus, and he had received a letter to punish, to persecute the assembly at the time, otherwise known as the early assembly, which were the people called of the way. When that happened, we are told that Yahusha met with Shaul. But what is more telling here, that we've always just run through the scripture, is that the word tells us that Yahusha spoke to Shaul in Aberith, or in Hebrew. Why did Yahusha speak to Shaul in Hebrew? What did he say? Let's just read together. Acts chapter 26, from verse 13 to 15, it reads, "And at midday, O king." So what is happening now is Shaul is being put to this judgment seat or court, where he must explain, because he's now being accused of blasphemy. He's being accused of turning the city upside down, just like Yahusha HaMashiach was also brought to court and unfairly accused of something that had no merit, that he was blaspheming, he was causing confusion. Shaul also went through the same persecution that Yahusha, our Messiah, went through. So he is now being given an opportunity to speak to King, I believe it was King Agrippa, but I stand to be corrected in this case, but it was before the king. And then his response then says, "At midday, O king, I saw in the way a light from the heaven, or the Shema, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me." So the people that journeyed with Shaul also are witnesses of what Shaul saw, this great light which was brighter than the sun, because they saw it too. And verse 14, it continues to say, "And when we had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language." Why did Shaul had to specifically say that Yahusha spoke to him in the Hebrew language? If it was not significant, he wouldn't have mentioned it. He would have just said that Yahusha spoke to me. But the fact that he's mentioning it, that Yahusha spoke to him in Hebrew, it is of significance. And hence then the question as to why did Yahusha speak to why did Yahusha speak to Shaul in Hebrew? Let's hear what Yahusha said in Hebrew to Shaul. He said, Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me? Also note this, Yahusha didn't say Paul, Paul, because Paul is an English name, but Shaul is a Hebrew name, and Yahusha addressed Shaul with his real name, with his original name, and everybody else was calling him Shaul. It is later in our Bibles that also called Paul, but there was no point where Yahuwah changed Shaul's name from Shaul to Paul. It is not written anywhere. It is just the people that translated the scriptures that they decided to call Shaul Paul. But just like they did with Jacob, whom they called James, it was their decision that they called him James, but he is Jacob, and there was no point where Yahuwah changed Jacob's name to James. We do know where he changed Abram's name to Abraham, which we understand, and it is provided in the scriptures that Yahuwah changed his name and he said, you are no longer Abram, but you are Abraham, for a father of nations have I made you to be. So we see the plural coming as then the father of the nations. And also Yahuwah changed Sarah's name from Sarai, which means princess, to Sarah, which means mother of the nations. And then we also see in the scriptures where Jacob's name was changed to Yasharal, for Yahuwah said after the incident of Jacob wrestling with him that Jacob said, I beg of you, tell me your name. And the scripture says the man, but it could have been the messenger that was sent by Yahuwah. And then and then the response was that from this man who was the messenger said, why do you want to know my name? Let me go, it is about to be done. And then Jacob said, I will not let you go until you bless me. And then this messenger then said to Jacob, what is your name? And Jacob said, Jacob. And then the man then said, from henceforth you shall not be called Jacob, but Yasharal, for you have striven, or you have wrestled not only with men as a prince, but you have also wrestled or striven with Alwa, or Al in short. Hence then his name changed to be Yasharal, the one who wrestles with Alwa or Al, and not only wrestles with Al or Alwa, but also wrestles with men or with princes. And that's what his name changed to. But also from that particular experience, we see and we learn the importance of the name change, what it signifies, that Yasharel speaks of someone who would not let go until he gets what he wants. And this is us also as Yasharal, that we should have that mentality that we are not people, we are not quitters. We're not going to say, oh, I prayed once and whatever I asked from Yahuwah I did not get, then it means it was not meant to me. That's why Yahusha says that ask and keep on asking, knock and keep on knocking. Seek and keep on seeking, and then if you do that, the door will be opened for you. If you keep on seeking, you will find. If you keep on asking, you will receive. So we are not quitters, as Yahusha. We are pursuing and trusting Yahweh for that which you want to see happening in our lives until we see it happen. Because even in this particular case, then this messenger then blessed Jacob at that particular time, and then obviously he was limping from there because he had touched the thigh of his leg. But then going back to it's very important that we keep to the original names that were given to us, and when it comes to the scriptures, that don't just take why the names were changed without understanding. Because in fact, if I were to ask you what does James mean, you wouldn't be able to explain that to me. It's just an English name. But Jacob has a name, and it means a wrestler, a one who wrestles, excuse me, as it happened in the womb, that he held the foot of his twin brother Esau as he was coming out. So there's always a meaning in Hebrew. That's why, and this also partly explains the answer. Sorry, it partly explains the question as to why do I teach from the Hebrew perspective? Why do I do what I do from a Hebrew perspective? Why do I speak from the Hebrew perspective? Why is my lifestyle from the Hebrew perspective? So without delaying, the conversation there went as such that Yahusha said to Shaul, 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 why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the gods. And I said, who are you, Adun? And he said, I am Yahusha, whom you persecute. So Yahusha spoke to Shaul in Hebrew tongue. And it was that important that even from the translators, they still maintain that it was that the conversation took place in the Hebrew tongue. And one thing that I love is that Yahusha says here, I am Yahusha whom you persecute. He doesn't say that I am Yahusha and you are persecuting my people, for we are one with him, with Yahusha. He is the head, and we as an assembly, collectively, we are his body. So anyone who touches us actually touches him, because it's his body as he is the head. Anyone who fights us actually fights him, because they are fighting Yahusha's body. And the same is true. Anyone who blesses the assembly blesses Yahusha, because the assembly is the body of Yahusha. Now, the second question that in relation to what we've just read in the book of Acts chapter 26 from verse 13 to 50 is then, why did Yahusha speak to Shaul in Abarith? Or why did Yahusha speak to Shaul in Hebrew? He could have spoken to him in Latin. And why am I saying that? Because at that particular time, Yehuda was colonized by Roman. The Yahudim were colonized. The whole area of Yehuda, otherwise known as Judah, was a colony of Italy, and the Romans were the one that were running the colony at the time. So we spoke about this also before, that when the colonizers come, they make the people of the colony to speak their language. Hence, I also said that as South Africans, we were colonized by a United Kingdom, and that is the reason why South Africans, we speak English and we drive on the right hand side of the road. On the other hand, the countries in Central Africa that were colonized by the French, they speak they speak French. They speak French, and also in terms of driving, they drive on the left hand side of the road. So when the colonizers come, they actually impose everything that is happening in the country from where they come from, and then they destroy and remove every asset that you have, which include a culture, language, beliefs, behavior, conduct, everything. They replace who you are by their culture as the colonizers. So in this particular case, Shaul understood very well the Roman language, or the Latin, basically. So Yahusha could have spoken to him in Latin. Not only did he speak Latin, but they also spoke Greek as well, as at that particular time the Greeks were in fact the whole world was Hellenized. The term Hellenized, or it refers to the influence by the Greek to nations. And so the Hellenization refers to the Greek influencing other nations. And what are they influencing them with? They're influencing them with their culture, they're influencing them with their language, they influence them with the traditions, they influence them with the ways of doing things. So that's why when you read through the scriptures in what is called the so-called New Testament, I've also explained why it should not be called the New Testament, but you can go through a different teaching the way I refer to the covenant there. That the language at the time that was spoken, they were speaking Greek, and they were also speaking Latin, and they were understanding both languages at the particular time. So Yahusha could have spoken to Shaul either in Latin or in Greek. And in particular, when it comes to prove that Shaul knew Latin, we see in the book of Acts. So in the book of Acts, chapter 22, from verse 25 to 29, this is the time also as they were beaten. Now Shaul has converted to the way, and he's now a follower of Yahusha. And they are now, the Pharisees of the time, they've now saying, you have now swapped seats, you are now of the way, you are now this particular sect. They actually called the way, or the Nazarene, they called it a sect. And it was, they were degrading it, and they were punishing them and persecuting them. So in this particular passage, we now take from what is happening in the book of Acts, chapter 25 to 29. Sorry, book of Acts, verse 25 to 29, and it reads, as they were stretching him out with straps, as they were beating Shaul, Shaul said to the captain who was standing by him, is it lawful for you to whip a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? Now they are beating Shaul, whom we know that Shaul is Hebrew, whom we know that Shaul, even he himself says in the book of Philippians, that he is from the tribe of Benjamin. But he is saying he is Roman, and we'll go to another teaching separately here is why was he calling himself a Roman. But as we continue to read verse 26, I'm reading from Acts 22, now on verse 26, and it reads, and when the captain heard, he went and reported to the commander. When the captain heard that Shaul is actually a Roman, he then went and reported to the commander, saying, watch what you are about to do, for this man is a Roman. And having come, the commander said to him, say to me, are you a Roman? So the commander wanted to verify this, what now has been said, that Shaul is Roman. He says, say to me, are you a Roman? And Shaul responded and said, yes. And the commander answered, With a large sum, I obtained this citizenship, because at the time you could buy citizenship. And this commander is saying it didn't come cheap for him to be a citizen of Rome. He said, with a large sum I obtained the citizenship. And Shaul said, but I was even born so. So he did not buy the citizenship, but he is saying that he was born so. And but I was even born so. Verse 29 says, then at once those who were about to examine him withdrew from him, and the commander was also afraid after he found out that he was a Roman, and because he had bound him. So even Shaul, then Acts chapter 22 is a proof that Shaul knew Latin, but still Yahusha did not address him in Latin, and he addressed him in Hebrew. And it is for this particular reason that when people are asking us, why are you so fascinated with Hebrew language? It doesn't matter. Yahuwah knows whether you speak from a Greek perspective, or from a Latin perspective, or from English perspective, or even Zulu perspective. He understands. But I spoke about this before, that even before I knew that Hebrew was the language of creation, my logic and my understanding of the term was that we all know that the scripture was written in Hebrew. And when the information is translated from one language to the other, it loses its essence. That's why it actually must be transliterated, not translated, because it loses its essence. It loses the certain words that in one language you cannot find. The certain words in Zulu that you cannot find to explain a word that is in Hebrew. And also, as language is moving from one to the other, even just the richness, I spoke about this, the richness of the Hebrew language, that it's not only defines something in letters, but it also defines something in colors, it defines something in numbers, it defines something in pictorial. That's why when you look at the scriptures, we look at the or when we look at the names, we look at the names not only from the letters point of view. An example is Aleph. Aleph is number 1, and the picture of Aleph is an ox, and an ox means a strong leader, or an ox actually means strength. It means a leader. So when we say that Yahuwah is the Aleph and the Tau means the end, and the end in pictorial, it is a mark, it is a sign. So all those information, it gets lost when it is translated from one language to the other. But an example is, a lot of us have used, we do the translation of Hebrew as far as Aleph Tau is concerned from a Greek perspective, where we say Alpha and Omega. So at that particular point, we just know that Alpha is the first, or the beginning, and Omega, a Greek word for the end. It ends there. But there is more from the Hebrew perspective. Aleph is not just the beginning. Aleph is represented in pictorially by an ox who leads not only the cows, but the entire family of including the children and the cows and so forth, who provides protection, who provides not only protection but also provision in terms of what they're going to eat. Those are the things that we see as a role of ox, which you wouldn't find in Greek. In Greek, it will just be the beginning and the number is 1. Again, from the Greek perspective, yes, we know that Omega means last, or it means the end, but you're not going to see the pictorial aspect of the mark, of the sign. And when we now going through the scriptures in the book of Revelation, talking about the mark and the sign and the mark of the beast and what is the mark of Yahuwah, that would have lost that understanding if we're only looking from in the scriptures from the Greek perspective, because the Greek perspective will not have the pictorial aspect, which now brings about the signal, the sign, and the mark. That is why it is important that we go back to the language of creation in terms of proper understanding. And that is why we see even Yahusha speaking to Shaul and addressing Yahusha, and Yahusha addressing Shaul in Hebrew. And that is why even Yahuwah himself, when he sent the Malak, when he sent the angel to teach Abram his word, and not only to teach his word, but to have it deduced in writing or written down. Specifically, Yahuwah said that the angel had to teach Abram in Abarit, in Hebrew. As I've already mentioned, that it could have been any other language that was used at the time. But as we close this particular section, we are now closing as we close this explanation of why from the Hebrew perspective, why we're teaching from the Hebrew perspective. There is a prophecy that Yahuwah gave us, and this is the hope that we have. And even as we are starting to learn Hebrew words, even as we're starting to learn Hebrew right now, this prophecy, which was mentioned by TzaphanYah, otherwise known as Zephaniah, and it is found in the book of TzaphanYah or Zephaniah chapter 3, verse 9 to 10, where Yahuwah prophesied through TzaphanYah or Zephaniah that he will restore this language that we lost in Babel. He will restore the language that we lost as a result of rebellion that took place by building the Tower of Babel. And this scripture then says, "For then I shall turn to the peoples a clean lip." Other version says a clean language, an original language. That original language that I spoke about in the book of Jubilees, chapter 12, verse 25, verse 20 to 27. And for that matter, the book of Zephaniah is in the Bibles that we all have access to. So you don't have to worry and saying, but we don't have all the books that Abigail is referring to. The book of Zephaniah or TzaphanYah is in the Bible that we have access to, where Yahuwah prophesied through Zephaniah saying, "For then I shall turn to the peoples a clean lip, a clean language, so that they can all call on my name. They can all call on the name of Yahuwah to serve him with one shoulder from beyond the rivers of Cush." And we know that in our days, Cush is Ethiopia. And at the time, actually, the region of Africa was actually at some point called Cush. Come from the rivers of Cush, my worshippers, the daughter of my dispersed one, shall bring my offering. So Yahuwah made this commitment. He made this utterance. This prophecy shall and is already being fulfilled, because right now we are now learning our identity. Right now we are learning really who we are, and right now we are taking on the identity of who we are, and we are learning the language, this language that was lost in Babel. And he says that my people are going to be coming and calling on my name, not longer calling on the title, but calling on his name, and his name is Yahuwah. To serve him with one shoulder from beyond the rivers of Cush, we will serve and give worship with this one language, with this one tongue. the daughters of my dispersed one. Yes, he dispersed us to all the four corners of the earth as Yasharel because of our disobedience, and that was a curse that had to happen, and it is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy or Devarim chapter 28 that if we sin, if we do not obey his commandments, this was going to happen. And indeed it happened, that he dispersed us and across the entire world. But he then made a promise, and that he says that he will gather us, and that he will we will all come back to him and give an offering to him. And as we come back to him, we are coming back to him now with this one language. This is why when I teach from the Hebrew perspective. This is why that I encourage you to also start learning from the Hebrew perspective. There's so much information that is out there on internet that even myself, I'm still learning, and I'm more and more I'm understanding. Hence, even when I make reference to the scriptures, I would quote the book in Hebrew as well as in English, and even the names, I'll quote them in Hebrew as well as it is, and as well as also in English. That is why I teach from the Hebrew perspective. We're now gonna end this teaching, or this session, or this actually explanation as to why from the Hebrew perspective. And then after this short break, we will then be looking at further the definition of the reign of Yahuwah, which then looks at Shalom. At this particular point, we then pause, and then we'll take it next. Shalom, brothers and sisters.